Winter didn't just arrive, it closed in. A retired SWAT officer vanished into the mountains, carrying a past he never spoke about. No badge, no backup, just the cold, and an aging German shepherd who refused to leave his side. As the storms grew stronger and his body began to fail, the past crept closer than the snow outside his door. This winter wasn't just about survival, it was about one question. Did a broken man still deserve peace? And long before the cold came, before the storms, before the mountains tested him, he was already fighting a battle no one could see. Stay with us. Subscribe for stories that stay with your heart. Winter settled over the mountains early that year, pressing down with a silence so deep it felt deliberate, as if the land itself had chosen isolation. The cabin sat on the edge of a narrow clearing, half buried in snow, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of ice that never fully melted even at midday. Smoke rose only occasionally from the stone chimney, thin and uncertain, the sign of a fire kept alive more by discipline than comfort. Inside lived a man who had once been trained to move through chaos, now measuring his days by the angle of light on the frost-streaked windows and the slow ache in his joints. His name was Ethan Cole, 63 years old, retired from a metropolitan SWAT unit nearly a decade earlier, though the word retired had never felt accurate. Men like him didn't retire. They withdrew quietly, often carrying more weight than they admitted. Ethan was tall but no longer imposing, his frame thinned by age and solitude, shoulders still broad but sloped forward as if permanently braced against impact. His face was sharply lined, angular in a way that suggested both discipline and erosion, the kind of face carved over years rather than born. Steel-gray hair, once kept cropped close to regulation, now grew longer and uneven beneath a knit cap, curling at the ends where he no longer bothered to trim it. A short beard covered his jaw, rough and silvered, not styled so much as neglected, and his eyes, pale, watchful, and deeply tired, carried the habit of scanning rooms even when no one was there. Ethan rarely spoke aloud anymore, not because he lacked words, but because silence had become safer. Words had a way of pulling memory forward, and memory, for him, was never passive. He had chosen this cabin, this mountain, because distance made remembering harder, or at least slower. The city had been full of reminders, sirens, radios, crowded sidewalks, reflections in glass that caught his uniform long after he stopped wearing it. Up here, there were only trees, snow, and the wind, and even those seemed uninterested in who he had once been. The cabin itself had been abandoned when he found it, a forgotten hunting structure built decades earlier, its logs dry-rotted in places, its floor uneven, but solid enough for a man who didn't plan on hosting visitors. Ethan had repaired what he could with salvaged wood and old tools, not out of hope, but habit. Fixing things was something he understood. People were harder. Every movement he made inside that cabin was economical, stripped of excess, the product of years of tactical training that never truly leaves the body. He stacked firewood the same way he once stacked equipment, checked the perimeter of the clearing each morning without consciously deciding to, and slept lightly, waking at sounds that didn't exist. The event that had driven him here was never far from his thoughts, no matter how much he tried to bury it beneath routine. It had been a raid, supposedly clean, supposedly controlled, on a warehouse tied to an armed trafficking ring. Bad intel, rushed timing, a door that should have been clear but wasn't. 2 men hadn't walked out. One of them had been Ethan's responsibility. He had replayed that moment so many times that the sequence had worn smooth, like a stone turned endlessly in the hand. He knew the official report by heart, knew the conclusions, knew the absolution that others had offered him. None of it mattered. Responsibility to Ethan had never ended when the paperwork did. It lodged itself deeper, changed shape, became something quieter and more corrosive. When he finally left the force, there were no ceremonies, no speeches. He packed what little he wanted, sold what remained, and drove until the roads thinned and the radio lost its signal. The mountains didn't ask questions. They didn't care why he came, only whether he could endure. He might not have, if not for Ranger. The German shepherd lay near the hearth. Most evenings his large body curled, despite the stiffness that age had etched into him. Ranger was old, at least 10, maybe 11. His muzzle grayed almost white, one ear permanently bent at the tip from an injury years back. His coat was thick and sable-colored, dark along the spine and lighter at the chest, though it had lost some of its former gloss. Scars marked him if you knew how to look, a faint line along one flank, a patch near the shoulder where fur grew thinner. His eyes were dark, intelligent and steady, the eyes of a dog that had learned patterns and consequences. Ranger had once worn a vest, had once responded to hand signals and commands spoken barely above a whisper. He no longer worked, not officially, but some instincts don't retire either. He followed Ethan with quiet devotion, moving slower now, joints stiff in the cold but still alert, still aware. When Ethan stopped talking to the world, Ranger became the only presence that didn't demand explanation. Their relationship wasn't sentimental. It was functional, grounded in mutual understanding. Ranger didn't offer comfort in the human sense. He offered constancy. Each morning, as Ethan stepped outside into the brittle air to assess the weather, Ranger stood beside him, breath clouding in the cold, ears shifting at distant sounds. The winter was harsher than usual. Snow had fallen early and often, burying trails and cutting off access to the lower roads. Ethan had prepared as best he could, but preparation is always an estimate, and estimates are only as good as the conditions that respect them. His supplies were running low. Canned food sat in neat rows on a shelf that grew emptier by the week, and the woodpile outside, though carefully rationed, shrank visibly. Ethan felt the strain in his body more than he admitted. His right knee, damaged years earlier during a breach gone wrong, flared in the cold, a dull, persistent ache that reminded him of limits he once ignored. He rapped it when it swelled, stretched when he could, but pain had become another quiet companion. At night, when the fire burned low and the wind pressed against the cabin walls, his thoughts wandered where he didn't want them to go. Faces surfaced uninvited, voices echoed. He found himself counting mistakes instead of sheep, measuring past decisions with a precision that offered no relief. Ranger sensed these moments, lifting his head, watching Ethan with an attentiveness that bordered on concern. Sometimes the dog rose with effort and crossed the room to settle closer, not touching, just near enough to be felt. Ethan never spoke during those times. He only stared into the fire, jaw clenched, breathing measured, waiting for the memories to loosen their grip. He told himself this life was a choice, that isolation was preferable to the damage he might do if he stayed among people. Up here, he believed, his failures were contained. The mountain absorbed them, diluted them with distance. Yet, as winter deepened, as the nights grew longer and the cabin creaked under the strain of cold and age, Ethan began to understand that retreat was not the same as escape. Survival required attention, effort, and a willingness to remain present even when the past pressed hardest. He had chosen this place to disappear, but the mountain, indifferent and relentless, was about to test whether disappearance was something a man could truly sustain. The storm announced itself long before it arrived, first as a low pressure in the air, then as a silence so complete it made the forest feel hollow. Snow began falling before dawn, thick, heavy flakes driven sideways by a wind that cut through layers of clothing as if measuring weakness. Ethan Cole woke with the familiar stiffness in his joints, already worsened by the sudden drop in temperature. He dressed slowly, methodically, layering wool and canvas, his movements careful not from fear but experience. Ranger watched from near the hearth, rising with visible effort, his hind legs stiff before locking into place. The dog shook once, sending a fine mist of ash and dust into the air, then followed Ethan toward the door. Outside, visibility shrank by the minute. The clearing that usually offered a narrow view of the tree line dissolved into a white wall, the mountains erased behind blowing snow. Ethan felt the unease settle in his chest, not panic but recognition. This wasn't a storm, to be waited out casually. It had weight, intention. He moved to the edge of the cabin and looked up at the roof. Ice had already begun to build along the eaves, thickening where meltwater refroze. He knew the structure well enough to understand its limits. If the load increased unchecked, the roof would sag further, possibly fail. He hesitated only a moment before deciding. Waiting was sometimes the most dangerous choice. He retrieved the old ladder from its place against the side wall, his breath forming tight clouds as he dragged it into position. Ranger paced below, circling, ears flicking at the wind. Ethan ignored the ache in his knee as he climbed, one rung at a time, gloved hands stiffening as snow coated the ladder almost immediately. He reached the edge of the roof and began knocking ice loose with a short-handled tool, careful, deliberate, avoiding sudden movements. The wind gusted harder, rocking the ladder. The moment came without warning. His foot slipped on a patch of hidden ice. His weight shifted wrong, and the ladder kicked out just enough to throw his balance. Ethan fell awkwardly, twisting as he tried to protect his head. Pain exploded through his right knee, sharp and immediate, stealing his breath. He landed hard in the snow, the impact sending a jolt up his spine. For several seconds, he couldn't move. Ranger was beside him instantly, whining low, nose pressing against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing air back into his lungs, assessing damage the way he had been trained to do under worse conditions. The knee burned, hot beneath layers of fabric, a familiar pain intensified beyond memory. He tried to bend it and failed. "Damn it," he muttered, the word tearing loose before he could stop it. With Ranger braced at his side, Ethan dragged himself upright and half-hopped, half fell back into the cabin. Once inside, he shut the door against the wind and leaned heavily against the wall until the room stopped spinning. Sweat chilled quickly on his skin. He lowered himself to the floor, breath shallow, hands already working to expose the injury. The knee was swelling fast, the joint stiff and unstable. He recognized the signs immediately. Old damage, aggravated, likely a torn ligament flaring under stress. Not life-threatening, but crippling in this environment. He moved without haste, because haste wasted energy. From a locked metal box beneath the cot, he retrieved supplies he hadn't touched in years. Elastic bandages, anti-inflammatory medication long past its prime, but stored dry and sealed. A rigid brace scavenged from a previous life. He cleaned his hands, wrapped the joint tightly, layered compression with practiced precision. Pain dulled slightly, retreating into a deep, relentless throb. He swallowed medication dry, grimacing. Mobility, however, was gone. Standing was possible only with support, each step a calculation. The storm intensified through the morning, snow piled against the eave, cabin walls climbing steadily. The fire burned low as the hours passed, and Ethan felt the creeping awareness of dependency settle over him. Tasks that once required effort now required strategy. He could not gather wood, he could not clear snow, he could not leave the cabin. Ranger adapted without instruction. The dog positioned himself near the door, head low, ears alert, tracking sounds beyond the walls. When the fire weakened, Ranger rose and limped to the woodpile just inside the threshold, grasping smaller branches in his jaws and dragging them across the floor, dropping them within Ethan's reach. The movements were clumsy, inefficient, but persistent. Ethan watched, equal parts gratitude and quiet shame tightening his chest. He had trained Ranger once. Now the balance had shifted. As night fell early beneath the storm clouds, the cabin grew colder. Wind found its way through every crack, howling like something alive. Ethan rationed fuel carefully, feeding the fire just enough to keep the interior above freezing. Hunger was a dull presence, less urgent than the pain and fatigue that pulled at him. Ranger stayed close, rising only when necessary, body angled toward Ethan even as he slept in short, broken intervals. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through the wind. A low scrape, deliberate, close. Ranger was on his feet instantly, hackles lifting, a warning growl vibrating deep in his chest. Ethan forced himself upright, heart pounding, hand reaching instinctively for a weapon that was no longer there. He listened, breath held. The sound came again, followed by a heavy snort. Elk, he realized, drawn by the shelter, confused by the storm. Ranger barked once, sharp and commanding, his voice carrying authority born of years of work. The sound retreated, fading back into the storm. Ranger returned to Ethan's side and lay down, eyes still open. Dawn came gray and indistinct. The storm showed no sign of breaking. Ethan stared at the ceiling, the reality of his situation settling fully for the first time. He was injured, isolated, and aging in a place that did not forgive weakness. The mountain did not care who he had been. It cared only whether he could adapt. He closed his eyes, not in defeat, but in resolve. If survival required reliance, then reliance would be accepted. Ranger shifted closer, warm and solid. Together, they waited out the worst of the winter's fury. The storm loosened its grip gradually, not with mercy but exhaustion, leaving behind a world reshaped and dangerous in quieter ways. When Ethan Cole finally pushed the cabin door open again, the air felt heavier than before, the cold deeper now that the wind had scoured everything clean. Snow lay packed and uneven across the clearing, hiding hazards beneath a smooth white surface. He moved carefully, leaning on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a stripped branch, each step deliberate, the injured knee wrapped tight and burning with dull insistence. Ranger stayed close, matching Ethan's slow pace, his gait stiff but purposeful, ears constantly shifting as he read the forest. The storm had changed the land. Branches lay snapped and half-buried. Fallen trees blocked familiar paths. What had once been routine now required re-evaluation. Ethan knew staying entirely confined to the cabin was no longer an option. Supplies were too low, and the structure itself had taken damage he had not yet fully assessed. Survival meant expanding the perimeter, even injured. They moved downslope toward a narrow ravine Ethan remembered only vaguely, a place where snow tended to drift less heavily due to wind patterns. Ranger led without being told, stopping often to check scents, occasionally glancing back as if confirming Ethan still followed. The ravine opened slowly, its edges jagged with exposed rock. There, half hidden beneath wind-packed snow and years of neglect, was something man-made. At first it looked like nothing more than a concrete scar in the earth, a low structure pressed into the hillside. Ethan stopped, breath shallow, recognition stirring uneasily. He approached with caution, heart rate quickening, not from fear but alertness. The entrance was narrow, reinforced with rusted steel framing, its door crooked on one hinge. Faded markings clung to the concrete above it, barely legible beneath ice and moss. This was no bunker built for comfort. It was a seasonal training shelter, likely constructed decades earlier for state or federal tactical exercises, then abandoned when funding dried up or priorities shifted. Ethan knew the type. Temporary, utilitarian, never meant to last this long. He tested the door with the end of his crutch, expecting resistance. It opened with a protesting groan that echoed inside, the sound swallowed quickly by darkness. Ranger hesitated only a moment before stepping in, nose working, tail low but steady. Ethan followed, forcing his injured leg forward, bracing against the wall until his eyes adjusted. The interior was cold and damp. Water dripped steadily from a crack in the ceiling. The air smelled of rust, mold, and old fuel. A single room opened before them, no larger than a small garage. Along one wall stood a metal workbench, its surface pitted and flaking. Shelving units leaned unevenly, most of them empty, though a few rusted containers remained. Nothing here promised rescue, but it promised shelter. Ethan shut the door behind them, not fully, just enough to block the wind. He leaned heavily against the wall, letting the relief wash through him slowly. This place would not save him. It would buy time. He spent the next hour taking inventory with the precision of habit. A cracked lantern without fuel. Several hand tools dulled but usable. Coils of old rope, stiff with age. A dented metal locker that yielded a thin thermal blanket and a pair of gloves long since hardened. No generator. No stocked supplies. Exactly what he had expected. Ranger explored methodically, sniffing corners, sneezing at dust, finally settling near the back wall where the concrete retained a trace of residual warmth from the earth. Ethan sat carefully on an overturned crate, knee screaming in protest. The realization settled in quietly. This shelter was closer than the cabin to several game trails. It was partially insulated by the hillside. If the cabin failed, or if another storm hit harder, this would be the fallback. He did not romanticize the find. He understood its limits. That understanding made it valuable. Over the following days, Ethan split his time carefully, returning to the cabin when weather allowed, then back to the shelter to improve it incrementally. Each trip was exhausting. Each decision carried weight. He reinforced the door with scavenged wood and rope, redirected dripping water into a container, cleared snow from the entrance. Ranger remained his constant shadow, sometimes ranging ahead briefly before returning as if tethered by an invisible line. On the third day, Ranger's behavior changed. The dog stiffened mid-step, ears locking forward, body angled toward the ravine's far end. Ethan followed the line of his gaze and saw what Ranger had already understood. Tracks, human, fresh enough to matter. They crossed the snow at an angle, booted, uneven, partially obscured but unmistakable. Ethan's pulse quickened. He crouched with effort, examining them closely. 8E, least 2 individuals. Heavy tread, not hikers, not lost tourists. His mind cataloged possibilities without panic. Poachers, most likely. The season and isolation made it attractive. He straightened slowly, the weight of the realization settling into something colder than fear. He was injured. He was alone. The mountain changed its voice before Ethan Cole ever saw them. It was not a sound so much as an absence, a subtle thinning of the forest's usual rhythm that set Ranger on edge. The dog stiffened near the shelter's entrance, ears angled forward, body unmoving in a way that spoke of focus rather than fear. Ethan noticed immediately. He had learned long ago to trust the silence when it behaved unnaturally. He shifted his weight carefully, easing closer to the narrow opening he had cleared as an observation slit. The knee protested, a reminder that speed was no longer an option, only patience. Through the slit, the ravine lay quiet, snow crusted and unbroken, until movement flickered at the edge of his vision. Two figures emerged from the tree line, moving downslope with the practiced confidence of men who believed themselves unobserved. They wore layered winter gear in muted colors, not military, not civilian hiking attire either. One was taller, broad-shouldered beneath his coat, his beard dark and thick, breath steaming as he spoke in low tones. The other moved with sharper economy, leaner, his face partially hidden beneath a hood, eyes constantly scanning. These were not amateurs. Poachers, Ethan judged, or illegal trappers at best, men accustomed to operating beyond oversight. The taller man laughed softly at something the other said, the sound carrying faintly in the cold air. That laugh settled something in Ethan's chest, not anger, but clarity. He was not the hunted here, but neither could he confront them. He observed instead, cataloging patterns the way he always had, their spacing, their pauses, the way they avoided the ravine center, skirting areas where snow drifted deepest. They were scouting, not just passing through. Ranger shifted beside him, muscles tense, awaiting instruction. Ethan placed a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder, grounding both of them. Time stretched. The men moved on, disappearing into the trees beyond the shelter. Ethan did not follow. He waited until the forest's natural sounds cautiously returned, then eased back, mind already working. That night, he adjusted everything. Fires were limited to brief intervals, fed just enough to prevent frostbite. Smoke was allowed only at times when wind patterns would scatter it quickly. He relocated half of his remaining supplies to the shelter, half back to the cabin, creating redundancy. The traps he set were not meant to injure, only to inform. Twine strung low between trees, small metal pieces scavenged from the shelter tied to branches, arranged to clatter softly if disturbed. Ranger learned their placements within hours, avoiding them instinctively. The next encounter came 2 days later. Ethan heard it first this time, a crunch that didn't belong to deer or elk, followed by the unmistakable scrape of metal against wood. Ranger rose, hackles lifting, a low growl forming. Ethan moved to the slit again, heart steady, breath controlled, one of the men stood near the shelter's perimeter, examining the snow-cleared entrance with open curiosity. The leaner one this time. His face was angular, skin weathered and pale, eyes sharp beneath the hood. He knelt, fingers brushing the reinforced doorframe. "Someone's been here," he said quietly, voice carrying just enough. The taller man joined him, scowling. "Old place," he replied. "Could be squatters." "Or someone who doesn't want company," the leaner man said. Ethan felt the moment stretch thin. He knew what came next. They would test boundaries, see what pushed back. He could not let that happen. He acted without revealing himself. From within the shelter, he triggered one of the sound traps set higher up the slope, a sudden clatter of metal echoing sharply through the ravine. Both men froze, heads snapping toward the noise. Before they could speak, another sound followed. Ranger's bark, deep and authoritative, amplified by the ravine's natural acoustics, echoing far louder than its source. The bark carried weight, the sound of a large trained dog defending territory. The men straightened. The taller one cursed under his breath. "Dog," he muttered, "and not a stray." The leaner man scanned the tree line, unease flickering across his face. "This place isn't empty," he said, "and whoever's here knows the ground." They backed away slowly, not retreating outright, but reassessing. Ethan stayed perfectly still, muscles burning, knees screaming silently. He waited until they vanished again before allowing himself to exhale. Ranger returned to his side, eyes bright, tail low but steady. "Good," Ethan whispered, the word rough from disuse. The following days became a quiet chess match. The men returned twice more, probing different approaches, each time met with uncertainty, unexplained sounds, shifting signals, the suggestion of watchfulness without confirmation. Ethan never showed himself. He let the mountains speak. For him, amplified by small, deliberate actions. He understood intimidation as well as he understood restraint. Eventually, The visits stopped. Tracks angled away from the ravine, heading lower toward easier ground. Ethan watched the last of them disappear through a break in the trees, a strange mixture of relief and fatigue settling into his bones. He had won without confrontation, without violence. The cost, however, was real. His body ached constantly. His knee had swollen again, angry and hot beneath its wrappings. That night, as he lay in the shelter, Ranger curled close. Ethan confronted a truth he could no longer ignore. He could still think like a SWAT officer. He could still plan, adapt, outmaneuver. But his body was failing in ways that strategy could not fully compensate for. Winter was not finished with him yet. And next time, intimidation might not be enough. As sleep finally claimed him, Ethan understood that survival here would demand more than avoidance. It would demand preparation for an endgame he had tried not to imagine. Spring did not arrive with celebration, only with small concessions the mountain made reluctantly, one frozen inch at a time. The first sign was the silence changing again, not the brittle stillness of snowbound weeks, but a softer quiet, layered with distant drips and the faint movement of water beneath ice. Ethan Cole noticed it one morning while sitting near the shelter's entrance, the injured knee propped stiffly. Ranger stretched beside him, ribs rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. The air was still cold enough to bite, but it no longer felt hostile. It felt tired. The mountain, like Ethan himself, had spent much of its fury. He tested his leg carefully, standing with the support of his crutch. Pain remained deep and stubborn, but it had changed character, less sharp, more manageable. Healing, he recognized, even if incomplete. He did not rush it. Rushing was how things broke. Over the following days, he moved deliberately between the shelter and the cabin, restoring what winter had threatened to take. Snow melted unevenly, revealing damage that had been hidden for months: warped boards, loosened stones, a section of roof that would need attention before the next season. Ethan worked in short intervals, resting often, accepting limitations with a patience he would not have tolerated in younger years. Ranger followed him everywhere, slower now, muzzle frosted almost entirely white, but eyes still sharp, posture still protective. The dog's age showed more clearly as the snow receded. Stiffness lingered longer in the mornings. Jumps once taken without thought were now avoided entirely. Ethan adjusted without comment, lowering steps, clearing paths wider, making space for both of them to endure. One afternoon, while reinforcing the cabin's doorframe, Ethan paused and looked around the clearing. For the first time since arriving in the mountains years ago, he did not feel like a trespasser in his own life. The space felt inhabited rather than hidden, used, claimed. That realization unsettled him more than any storm had. He had come here to disappear, to contain the damage he believed himself capable of spreading. Yet the mountain had forced him to remain present, to make decisions, to protect rather than withdraw. The winter had stripped away excuses. Survival had demanded engagement. On a quiet evening, as the fire burned low and the last of the snow glowed faintly outside the windows, Ethan retrieved an object he had not touched since before the storm. From the bottom of a metal case, wrapped carefully in cloth, he removed his old SWAT badge. It was worn smooth at the edges, the engraving dulled, the metal cool in his palm. He had brought it with him out of habit rather than intention, a relic he told himself he would discard someday. He turned it over slowly, memories rising without permission. The men he had served with, the trust placed in him, the night everything fractured. He waited for the familiar surge of guilt, the tightening in his chest. It came, but it did not consume him. The winter had changed something fundamental. He understood now that leaving had not erased responsibility. It had only delayed reckoning. Survival, he realized, was not absolution, but it was not punishment either. It was continuation. He placed the badge on a wooden beam near the hearth, not as a symbol of authority, but as acknowledgement. This, too, had shaped him. Ranger lifted his head, watching, then settled again, satisfied. Days lengthened. The threat of poachers did not return. Tracks softened and vanished. The mountain reclaimed its rhythms. Ethan resumed routines that felt less like defense and more like living. He repaired tools, reorganized supplies, expanded the shelter's usefulness into something intentional rather than desperate. The knee would never fully recover. He accepted that without bitterness. Adaptation, he had learned, was not surrender. One morning, he and Ranger stood together at the edge of the clearing, sunlight cutting through bare branches, warming the snowmelt into thin streams that traced the ground. Ranger leaned lightly against Ethan's leg, a small gesture, almost accidental. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back, feeling the slow, familiar rise of breath beneath his palm. "We made it," he said quietly, the words carrying no triumph, only recognition. The mountain did not respond. It did not need to. Winter had tested them, not to break them, but to reveal what remained when nothing else could be relied upon. Ethan understood now that isolation had never been the solution he believed it to be. Engagement, careful, limited, honest, was. He was not healed. He was not redeemed in any dramatic sense, but he was still standing, and the winter at last had loosened its grip. In the end, this story isn't really about surviving the cold, the wilderness, or even the past. It's about endurance, the quiet kind that doesn't make headlines. Like Ethan, many people carry old wounds into everyday life, regrets from work, losses in family, mistakes we never fully forgive ourselves for. We don't escape them by running farther or hiding longer. We survive by facing them one honest day at a time, by adapting, by accepting help when we need it, and by choosing to keep going even when the weight feels heavy. Winter eventually passes, but what truly matters is who we become while we're enduring it. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Let us know in the comments what part spoke to you or what season of life you're currently facing. And if you enjoy thoughtful human stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Thank you so much for watching and Happy New Year.